Scotland in the mid-1700s was a land divided. The Highlands burned with loyalty to their heritage, their clans bound by blood and by honor. Yet the crown in London tightened its grip, and whispers of rebellion stirred in every tavern and glen. The cause of the Jacobites was simple in its hope, but dangerous in its reality: to restore Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, to the throne. For many, this was a chance to reclaim lost glory. For others, it was a path that could only lead to ruin. And into this storm stepped Jamie Fraser. He had not sought leadership, nor had he asked to carry the weight of history. But destiny does not always wait for permission. The clans looked to him with trust because Jamie was not only a skilled warrior, he was a man of loyalty, of courage, of unshakable will. His presence alone could steady frightened men and rally hardened fighters. On the fields where banners rose and swords clashed, Jamie's name carried more than the sound of a soldier. It was the voice of a leader, a man who could stand at the edge of despair and still inspire hope. Yet deep inside, Jamie felt the heavy truth. Every decision he made would decide the lives of thousands. Every command could lead men to glory or to graves they had not yet dug. This was no ordinary fight. This was a war where the heart of Scotland itself trembled. And as Jamie Fraser tightened his grip on his sword, the mist around him was not just the weather of the Highlands. It was the shadow of history, waiting to decide whether Scotland would rise or fall forever. The Highlands were alive with whispers, as if the mountains themselves carried the weight of secrets. Fires burned in hidden glens and men gathered in the night, their breath turning to smoke in the cold air. They spoke of a prince across the sea, young, bold, and filled with promises. Charles Edward Stuart, the man they called Bonnie Prince Charlie, had landed in Scotland, and with him came a spark that could set the whole land aflame. But sparks are dangerous. They can light the path to freedom, or burn everything to ash. The Jacobite cause was more than just politics. It was blood, faith, and pride. Families who had suffered under English rule dreamed of a Scotland ruled by their own. Old wounds ran deep, and each man who joined the cause carried not just a sword, but a personal reason to fight. For some, it was the promise of honor. For others, revenge. In the middle of this stood Jamie Fraser. He was not a prince nor a man crowned with titles. He was something rarer. He was trusted. Clan chiefs respected his wisdom. Soldiers followed his steady hand, and even men twice his age listened when he spoke. He could cross the line between fiery rebels and cautious allies, binding them together with words as sharp as steel. When Jamie rode beside the prince, he carried more than his own fate. He carried the fragile hope of Scotland, balanced on the edge of a blade. The men who marched behind him did not see him as just another commander. They saw him as the bridge between their dream and their survival. Yet even then, the shadows of doubt whispered around every fire. Could one man's leadership turn passion into victory? Or was Jamie leading them straight into a future written in blood? Jamie Fraser had always been a fighter. He knew the weight of a sword, the rhythm of battle, the sting of wounds that left scars deeper than flesh. But leading an army, that was different. Leadership was not only about bravery. It was about carrying the fears of hundreds and still walking forward. At first, Jamie did not see himself as a general. He saw himself as a man among men, bound to fight for Scotland because it was his home, his blood, his heart. Yet the clans looked to him in moments of silence, when orders needed to be spoken and courage needed to be lit like fire in the cold. They saw something in Jamie that he could not yet see in himself. Day by day, his voice grew stronger. He was no longer just giving commands, he was shaping the will of the men around him. A soldier hesitated, and Jamie's steady hand pushed him onward. A clan leader doubted the prince, but Jamie's calm words steadied the bond. Even those who argued with him could not deny the strength in his eyes, the sense that he would never ask another man to walk a road he would not walk himself. But transformation does not come without cost. Each night, when the campfires dimmed and the songs faded, Jamie felt the weight press down. He thought of Claire, of family, of the quiet life he might have lived if destiny had not pulled him into the storm. He asked himself if he was guiding his men toward freedom, or leading them into ruin. Still, when dawn broke and the sound of drums rolled through the hills, Jamie rose. His doubt stayed hidden in his heart, buried beneath the armor of duty, for his men needed not just a warrior, but a leader who could make them believe. And Jamie Fraser, whether he wished it or not, had become exactly that. The call did not begin with drums or banners. It began with whispers, echoes carried from glen to glen, from hearth to hearth. Jamie Fraser is with the prince. Those words alone could turn doubt into resolve. Men who once kept their swords hanging in silence now sharpened their blades under the moonlight. Fathers kissed their children goodbye. Sons left behind the safety of the fields. For the Highlands were stirring, and Jamie was the heartbeat of their march. When Jamie spoke, he did not shout like a king, nor command like a tyrant. His words were forged in truth. He reminded his men that Scotland was more than land. It was memory, blood, and the voices of ancestors buried in the hills. He spoke of a future where their children would not bow to foreign crowns. And in his voice, even the weary found strength. The gathering was not easy. Clans carried old grudges, bitter feuds that had lasted longer than some men's lifetimes. Yet in Jamie's presence, those rivalries were silenced. He rode among them, not above them, and each man felt seen, valued, and bound to the same cause. Under his guidance, quarrels turned to unity, and scattered fighters became an army. But every step forward was heavy. The roads were long, the nights bitter, the rations thin. Still the men marched because Jamie marched with them. He endured the same hunger, the same cold, the same fear of what waited beyond the horizon. They trusted him not because he promised safety, but because he carried their suffering as his own. And so the call to arms was more than a summons to battle. It was a bond sealed in hardship and hope. The Jacobite Army was no longer just a gathering of clans. It was a force led by a man who had become their anchor, their fire, their shield, and at its center stood Jamie Fraser, unwilling, uncertain, yet utterly unbreakable. The battlefield was not only made of blood and mud. It was also shaped in the dim glow of council tents, where voices clashed sharper than steel. Around the map tables, clan leaders argued like storm winds, each man certain his path was the only path. One wanted bold charges, another demanded caution, and over it all, the prince dreamed of glory that seemed too bright for the dark road ahead. Jamie Fraser stood among them, not with the arrogance of command, but with the weight of reason. He listened first, his eyes tracing the lines of rivers and valleys marked in ink. He knew the land, knew the men, knew that victory was not won by pride but by patience. Yet speaking against chiefs and princes was dangerous. To challenge them was to risk losing trust, but to remain silent was to risk losing Scotland. Time after time, Jamie stepped into the storm of voices. His words were calm, but they carried iron. He urged strategy where others cried for recklessness. He reminded them that men were not pawns, but fathers, sons, and brothers. Still, his voice did not always triumph. The prince's dream often drowned out reason, and Jamie's heart twisted as he watched decisions born of pride carve paths toward ruin. This was the hardest fight for Jamie, not on the field with sword in hand, but in the silence after councils ended. When the men cheered and sharpened their blades, Jamie carried the bitter truth. He could guide, he could warn, but he could not command destiny. Each time he walked back to his campfire, he carried the faces of men who trusted him. And each choice made above him felt like a stone added to the burden he bore. Conflict was everywhere, between clans, between leaders, between hope and harsh reality. Yet Jamie remained unbroken, because his men needed his strength more than ever. Even when he feared the road ahead was carved in tragedy, he walked it with steady steps. For to falter would be to abandon them, and Jamie Fraser was no man to abandon his own. Beneath the roar of armies and the clash of councils, Jamie Fraser carried a quieter war, the one inside his chest. By day he was the commander, the leader men followed without question. But at night, when the fires burned low and silence wrapped around the camp, he became only a man. Husband, father, son of Scotland. And in that silence the burden pressed hardest. He thought of Claire, her voice steady even when the world crumbled. Her touch, her wisdom, her love, they were his anchor. Yet every mile he marched with the Jacobites took him farther from her arms, and closer to a fate she had already warned him about. Claire had spoken of a battlefield that would end in blood, of Culloden where hope would shatter. To ignore her words was to defy the woman he trusted most. But to follow them meant abandoning his people, his honor, his land. Each choice was a blade cutting at his soul. How could a man choose between the life of his wife and the freedom of his country? How could he walk away from men who had placed their lives in his hands? Jamie bore the torment silently, never showing the depth of his fear to the soldiers who drew strength from his calm. But when he looked into the fire, he saw faces, not only of his men but of the children who would grow up under the shadow of whatever future he created. Still, he did not bend. Duty and love pulled him in opposite directions, but Jamie carried both. Every command he gave, every march he led, was for the men who trusted him and for the family he prayed to see again. His heart was torn in two, yet he walked forward as if whole, because that is what true leaders do. They bleed inside, but they never let the world see them fall. And so Jamie Fraser carried not just the fate of Scotland on his shoulders, but the quiet ache of a man who risked losing everything he loved. The battlefield was waiting, and so was destiny. The drums of war would one day fall silent, but the echoes of Jamie Fraser's march would never fade. History remembers the Jacobite Rising as a doomed rebellion, a dream crushed beneath the weight of empire. Yet within that storm stood a man whose name carried more than just the sound of defiance. Jamie was not born to wear a crown or to lead nations, yet he carried the hope of a people on his shoulders with the strength of a king. He was the leader who never sought glory, the warrior who bore every wound as if it were his own men's, the husband who loved with a depth that even war could not break. Jamie's journey with the Jacobites was not only about battles and banners, it was about the heart of Scotland itself, burning fiercely against the dying of the light. When we look back on that time, we see more than the tragedy of Culloden. We see the fire of men who dared to dream, and at the center of it a Highlander whose courage bound them together. Jamie Fraser led not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And in that choice, he became immortal, not in thrones, not in crowns, but in the memory of every heart that still beats to the rhythm of Scotland's story. So when the mist rolls over the Highlands and the wind carries the sound of distant drums, perhaps it is not only history we hear, perhaps it is the echo of Jamie Fraser, standing once more at the head of the Jacobite Army, carrying a hope too great to ever truly die.